Midterms, the less glamorous part of being a college student. As you might have noticed, I've been gone from my channel for a little bit, and that was why. Now that I've gotten a few grades back and I've managed to not NC any of my classes, I thought I would give you some of my tips on how to study efficiently and ace your midterms. So I had midterms in 3 classes, but I'm mainly going to be talking about 2 as sort of case studies for different types of classes you might encounter. So I'm going to be talking about physics, which is a quantitative, more problem set based class, and then epidemiology, which is memorization and definition heavy. Given that these are very different classes, I also studied for them in very different ways, which I'll get into. But first, what I did for all of my classes was write a game plan. So I used Notion, not sponsored, which is essentially a mobile and desktop app for task managing, planning, writing down your thoughts, etc. But ultimately, it doesn't matter where you write down your game plan, just write it down, do it. This was actually the first time I've taken the time to break down the steps of how I'm going to study for midterm and writing out this game plan, and I've noticed a huge difference in the amount of stress that I experience and how prepared I feel for the exam. So I wrote down my step-by-step plan on how I was going to study for each class about a week in advance, and then ordered the to-dos in priority by dragging them around. Plus, I made sure to include really important announcements from professors on course material and the content that was going to be covered by the exam. Okay, so how did I study for each type of class? For a class that is really quantitative or problem-based, so the highest yield way to prepare for these kinds of exams, like universally, is to just do as many problems as you possibly can. For physics, I did literally every odd book problem that there was. It's helpful to do these problems with a friend in the class and check answers with each other if you're doing even problems. But with that being said, it's really not useful to keep doing problems if you consistently get them wrong and you don't know why. At that point, you want to go back to the material that you covered and understand the concept. So that is why I recommend always starting with brushing up on concepts, writing down key equations in a summary sheet. Make sure you review specifically from the lecture notes because that's what your professor is testing you on. The book tends to be pretty low yield because your professor wants you to know what they think is important, not necessarily what the book thinks is important, which is a key thing to distinguish. After you review the key concepts from those chapters that you're tested on, make sure to review and or redo your homework sets. I think those problems tend to be representative of what kinds of things you would see on the exam, and then just do straight like more book problems. Do as many problems as you can. Once you've gotten enough practice under your belt, do the previous year's exams. These are, once again, the most high yield thing to study / practice with. But one key thing is that I saved the most recent year's exam for the very, very end. After this, do more practice problems, more book problems, do your homework problems again, whatever. But keep in mind that when you get things wrong, you should note down what you got wrong and why. Like, you really need to understand what mistakes you've made. I have a huge ass list of things that I got wrong when studying for physics because, surprise, I get a lot of things very, very wrong. Making those mistakes is really important because those are the things that you are really, really cognizant of during the exam, and you double check everything to make sure that you don't make those same mistakes that you did when you were practicing. And then finally, do the most recent year's exam. You want to simulate taking the exam as if it's the real thing, and it'll give you a pretty good estimate of how you're going to perform on the actual test day. And then, if you still manage to have time after doing all of the previous year's exams, all the book problems, etc., you know what to do now. Say it with me, kids. Do more problems. But also, like, jokes aside, it's really important to stay well rested. If you manage to get through this list and you still have time, honestly, like, take a nap. One of the most important things you could do is get a solid 8 hours of sleep the night before your exam. I always take a 1-hour nap before like my really intense midterms because like I don't want to fall asleep in the middle of the exam. Alright, so moving on to the memorization-based class. In epidemiology, most of the information is taught through PowerPoint slides. If your class is taught through PowerPoint, this is an indication that it's going to be pretty memorization-based. You just have to study off the slides. Since it was emphasized that the exam, again, would be tested from the slides, I took summary notes for the PowerPoints. I found from the past that the most benefit comes from actually producing the study guide, taking the time to condense these notes, rather than actually reading them back. So a lot of the times I'll write my study guides and then never read them back. It's kind of weird, but that's really worked for me in the past. The reason why is because reading back notes is incredibly passive in when you're learning, and you want to practice as much active recall as possible. So in my case, the only time that I read my entire note set back for epidemiology was so that I can make my Quizlet. A lot of this class is focused on memorizing basic definitions and measures of disease occurrence, so I made a Quizlet with all major definitions and questions that the professor had asked in class. Once I made all of this content, I used the learn function. It took me a few hours to get through the whole thing. It was about 100 flashcards, and after that, I honestly felt pretty set for the exam. If your professor asks the same question in lecture over and over again, like, they really want you to know that they will test you on that during the exam. And then again, this is true for any one of your classes. The best way to study, the most high yield source that you can study from, is the past year's exams. I didn't mention this earlier, but for physics, I knew it was a more challenging class, so I studied for this class about 5 days in advance, but I studied very intensely. But for epidemiology, which was 2 days after my physics midterm, I only started studying after I finished physics. I already had like a pretty decent grasp of the concepts in class, so I just took the practice exam as like a sort of diagnostic and felt that I was in pretty good shape. So after that, I just used the Quizlet. In a situation where you're really pressed for time and your options are to review your notes again that you took, or to take the practice exam or review the practice exam again, I would definitely go for reviewing the practice exam. Okay, finally, I wanted to end with some general tips as sort of a recap. I know this is a pretty long video. So one, the most important thing you can take away from this is practice exams, if available to you, are the most high yield way to prepare for your exam. Anything that is written by your professor, your problem sets, your labs, etc., you want to study those the most because your professor wrote those and wrote the exam. When professors say review textbook readings as a supplementary material, that usually means don't study using the textbook. Like, it's just not going to be the best use of your time, especially if you're on a crunch. If you want to use it because you're interested in the topic or like didn't understand something super clearly in class and the textbook explains it, then go ahead. Just keep in mind that the textbook tends to be a lot more detailed than necessary. This might be like my most controversial study tip, but I personally think intensely studying for 4 to 5 days is a lot more effective than low dosages of studying for like 1.5 to 2 weeks. This might be contrary to like the popular advice of like frequent memory rehearsal, but I think like you really need to get to that high level of intensity of studying to retain so much information. Personally, in my previous experience, it's just like not practical to study so intensely for a class for more than 4 days. With that being said, you definitely want to keep up with the material. You don't want to get to a week before the exam to realize like, oh shit, like I really have no idea what's going on in the class, which I have been there. And if you are extremely lost like a week or 2 before the exam, that's okay. Like, I've been there so many times, but you need to recognize that you are really lost. You need to find out what you are not understanding specifically and make a list of those concepts, and then seek out as many resources available to you as possible. So homework drop-in hours, lab hours, TA hours, talk to your professor after class. Like, I remember in general chemistry, literally after every single class, like I'd be so confused that I just asked my professor questions like in the front of the class, and it honestly really did help me learn. For weeks prior to the exam, you want to like focus on targeting what you don't know and having a basic understanding of every single concept that's being covered, enough to like be able to like do your homework. But 4 days, 5 days before the exam, you want to really start hitting the books and intensely studying. So that's all for this video. It was definitely a doozy, like a very long video. Thank you for sticking through. I hope this helped. Leave a comment down below with a study tip that has been really helpful for you, one that I either mentioned in this video or didn't. And that's all I have. So I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye!